Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa. How are you today as we embark on a huge topic?
I know. I'm all a tingle thinking about the exciting topic we're going to cover today.
That's a new one.
I know. Sorry. That's like slightly creepy and weird. But I don't mean it in a creepy and weird way. I mean it in an excited way.
No, all a tingle never sounds not creepy and weird. Vanessa, we are going to get into a topic that is both evergreen and newsy. And that topic is, of course, the social media ban for kids under age 16 in Australia. And it's newsworthy because it has all gone down in the last couple of weeks of November and the very beginning of December. It is evergreen because how many episodes have we done about social media on this podcast?
I think we've done at least 8 about tech and social media, and we're actually going to link to all of them because they're excellent. We had awesome guests like Devorah Heitner, Emily Weinstein, and Carrie James. We've done some episodes solo, and we can point to an episode by Psychologists Off the Clock where they did a roundtable with folks like Ellen Galinsky and Emily Edlin. So there's a lot of really, really great content on our platform and elsewhere exploring this issue.
And our newsletter, we'll have a newsletter that summarizes all of them, right?
So we'll do a newsletter that summarizes all of them. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll get that. And yet, Cara, it seems like...
And yet,
yes. It's never enough, because what happened to you this week? What question did you get?
Well, I was doing an event at a local bookstore here in LA, Zibby's Books. Big shout out to Zibby's, who's an incredible supporter of all authors. They run tons of community events. It's an incredible space. And I was doing this event on Giving Tuesday, Vanessa, and I was the moderator of a panel, and there were incredible women who run nonprofits. And the whole point of the panel was to talk about Giving Tuesday and all the ways to give back and how to engage kids in giving. And this was the point.
Like two very favorite people, Sonali Bridges from Shiro's Rise and Melissa Burton from the PAD Project, who are doing incredible work empowering young people to be out in the world, active, building confidence, self-esteem, engagement, all of that. And then what happened?
Okay, so then I open it up to Q&A, and there are these 2 women sitting in the very front row. And I mean, I never make age assumptions, but I'm just going to call it here. They were definitely grandparents, not parents, and their arms shot up really fast. And I said, "Oh, sure. First question. Have at it." And one of them said, "Talk about social media." I was like, help me understand, how does this connect to Giving Tuesday? I'm happy to answer in any way you want. She's like, "Oh, it doesn't. Just talk about social media." And, I mean, first of all, just a shout out to all trusted adults who are interested in this topic, and grandparents in particular who are trying to wrap their brains around something that if we as parents are struggling with this, I think it goes double or triple for the grandparent generation. But also, it's a good reminder, Vanessa, that everywhere we go, at every cocktail party, at every school game, at Zibby's Books, no matter what we're talking about, the questions that come back to us are, "That's so interesting, and tell me about social media," because I don't understand how to wrap my brain around how limits are being set, what the rules are, what the right way to handle it is. What did Jonathan Haidt and the Anxious Generation do to move the needle? Where did it go right? Where did it go wrong? How can schools be involved? All of it.
Cara, I was at an anniversary dinner with my husband, and we were sitting next to a table of...
Did he ask you about
4
social media?
Parents. No, he spends all his life, his whole career is on social media. And I get up to leave my anniversary dinner, and a woman stops me and says, "Excuse me, are you Vanessa from This Is So Awkward?" I said, "I am." She said, "We're having a debate at the table about social media and limits and how to do it. And she said, have you guys done any episodes? So I said, DM me. I will send you episodes. I said, better yet, join our membership and you can search for every newsletter and episode we've ever done. And before I could go catch up with my husband, they asked me a bunch more questions. My husband, I got to the bar and he was like, what happened to you? I said, social media questions. And he was like, say no more. So this is it. This is front of mind.
This is it.
And we would be remiss if we didn't point to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, as a major catalyst in accelerating and amplifying this conversation, this debate, people's worries and stress. And we will get into that in more depth. I do want to point, Cara, that we did an analysis of Haidt's book specifically as it relates to his use of the word puberty. And for those who haven't listened to that episode, we will link to it. Go listen to it. But essentially, it boils down to, and I will say this quite flat out, a very lazy use of the word puberty and lacking research, depth, exploration in a way that he does actually much more responsibly in other ways in the book on other topics.
Yeah. And I want to braid all these threads together here with some, let's sort of frame this conversation in the facts around why this matters, why exactly what just came out of your mouth matters, which is the following. So in Australia, over the course of 1 week, I think it was, a final version of a law that had sort of been floated a couple weeks back and was in the press a little bit. But the final version of this proposed law was written, circulated, and voted into law. Like that is lightning speed. And as a result of that, in 1 year in Australia, if you are under the age of 16, you are not allowed on social media. There's no grandfather clause here. If you're on it now and you're 14, in a year, you're going to be off it because you're still under 16. So that's sort of fact one. A couple details around that. No clarity in the law about how it'll actually work. No clarity in the law about how it will be enforced. There is clarity that the onus is on the platforms themselves and not on the parents and not on the government. This is sort of important pieces to this conversation because we're going to talk in a little bit about partnership and how this works.
And how we do anything with kids, which is everyone needs to be involved. But anyways, I'm backing off from my editorializing. Keep going.
It's great, but the deep eye rolls, for those of you not on YouTube watching this, like Vanessa, one eyeball actually went away. It was like so deep, that eye roll.
You got a taste of what I was like when I was 16 because my eye rolling skills are spectacular.
They're very good. Your eyes roll almost independently of one another.
I have such huge eyes that there's like so much opportunity. Yeah. So deep eye roll on.
Deep eye roll.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's sort of framing there in terms of the law. Another sort of set of facts that I think we should just lay out. What counts as social media in this law? It's the platforms TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit, X, and Instagram. What does not count, Vanessa? Do you want to walk through those?
Yeah. So what they have not included are messaging platforms like WhatsApp. And I'm actually surprised that Snapchat hasn't tried to, or there isn't some sort of carve out for Snapchat, because one could argue that they are a messaging platform, but they're also social media. And gaming platforms, which if you listen to our episode with Alok Kanodia on how to raise a healthy gamer, you will know that the same concerns that are going to come up about social media and mental health and wellness are really similar to the concerns around gaming. And by the way, we hear the same questions from parents about gaming as we do about social media. And yet gaming is carved out or not included in this law, and social media is there. And so those are two important things. We will get later about how shocking it is in some ways that messaging is not included because we have real thoughts and opinions on that as well.
A couple of others that are not included because they exempted health and education services. So buckle your seatbelt for this. Okay, Google Classroom, I get it.
Get it?
YouTube.
I mean,
that was fascinating to me.
Bananas.
YouTube. And then, I don't know if you did this, but I went on a deep dive. I couldn't get the answer. Is Pinterest included? And the reason I wanted to know about Pinterest, you know why I wanted to know about Pinterest. I know why,
but folks, buckle up because get ready for this one.
Pinterest is a porn gateway, which is like
one
so
of
shocking.
The top 10 places that kids discover porn. And Cara, how about Google Maps as also in the top 10 places where kids discover porn?
And I don't think Google Maps is. So this was not a porn focused ban. This was a social media focused ban, but I've just sort of, I often share that I think LinkedIn is social media. Vanessa often laughs at me, but I believe by the end of 2025, Vanessa is going to be on that bandwagon and Australia might ban it for under 16.
I think it is. I think LinkedIn is social media for adults. I think it's not social media in the same way
this
for
is true.
Young people, but
you mean your kids aren't clamoring to go on LinkedIn?
Well, no, but my oldest, who's a college senior, spends, I don't know how many hours a day he spends on LinkedIn. I mean, frankly, I'd rather he do that than TikTok. But yes, it's fascinating what got included and what didn't. And while we're talking about porn, I'm just going to say, okay, ban social media. We can talk about that. How about banning porn? How about making sure that kids aren't seeing people having all sorts of wild and frightening forms of sex when they're children?
Right. And so we're going to get into sort of that, I think, is exactly what we're going to get into, the distinction and what the driver was here. But I wanted to do one other piece of framing in this conversation before we really get into it. And that is the framing of, yes, this is all happening in Australia, but it's actually happening in lots of places around the world. Like France has lots of laws that are starting to age-gate social media.
Norway,
and the United States, Vanessa. This is very much a local conversation. In the US, there are several states that have passed laws that are either already in effect or will be going into effect by July of 2025. 9 of them, actually: Connecticut, Louisiana, Texas, Maryland, Utah, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, Minnesota, are all states with laws on the books having to do with age gating. There are more states that are looking at what are called currently injuncted laws, and acts, social media safety acts: Arkansas, Ohio, California. So we're starting to see a tide move across the US as well. And so while we're talking about literally a country halfway around the globe, we're also very much having a conversation about where we live, what the rules are. And I think what we have to get to is really what the rationale behind the rules is, so that we can agree as a culture on whether or not there should be age gating and what else might be gated in addition to this kind of content.
And it's important to recognize that in the US, whole states and school districts have banned cell phones either during the school day or in certain parts of the school or certain times during the school day, that there are all sorts of other regulations happening. And I will say that I support a lot of what's happening in and around schools. And I think Jonathan Haidt's book really accelerated and amplified efforts to make that happen. So what you'll notice is this conversation is a real-time conversation where Cara and I are reacting, thinking. We're going to give you data. We're going to try not to editorialize too much. We are going to give some insights, advice, thoughts on how to be in conversation on these topics. But there's some real science, or lack thereof, that is at the heart of some of the decisions about the age gating and the ban, how they came up with the ages for this ban. And I think that is at the heart of the conversation we need to have today.
Okay, Vanessa. So let's talk about the science behind these bans. And let's start with talking about the rule of age 13, right? Which is the heart of, I never know if it's COPPA or COPPA. And honestly, I've heard it pronounced both ways, but it's the rule about kids
Is it
under
double P or single P?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Yes. So let's just talk about that for a second, because this is an important place to start the conversation. And the law basically says, if you are under the age of 13, you cannot be on social media. Now, that law was not built on science. That law did not come from a set of data that looked at brain development or pubertal development or decision-making capability or anything else measurable and objective. That law came from a political compromise, and it was about selling data. And I think a lot of people who worked in and around the tech industry and the sort of content business, if you will, that's kind of the business we're in. A lot of people just accepted the very vague framing of that law because it felt like it was right. It felt like, yes, we should not sell the data of these minors. And by the way, also, it's a really great excuse for parents who aren't ready to have their kids experiencing these different social networks online. It was a great excuse to say, it's illegal. You can't be on it, right?
And I mean, 13, that's technically the first teen year. So I
Correct.
could also imagine that somebody was like, oh, well, there's like a natural barrier. By the way, it's COPPA, COPPA, even though you and I are going to keep calling it COPPA.
No, because it's like CARA, COPPA.
COPPA, yes.
Yes.
CARA.
Okay. But you know what? Now I want to just say, I did a quick search of Australian teenagers and how many of them are on social media, because this is going to become an issue, right? Vanessa, 92% of 15 and 16-year-olds in Australia are on social media. Okay. They've crossed that 13-year-old barrier. Now we're going to have to figure out, Australia is going to have to figure out how to get those 92% of their kids off. 59% of 11 to 12-year-olds in Australia are on social media. And I don't know how they define that in these studies, because some of the reports describe exposed to and some describe on. So I don't know if they have their own logins or not, but more than half of kids under the age of 13, that 11 to 12-year-old bracket, are on, and 29% of 9 to 10-year-olds. So these rules that exist that are very global, like these,
and we don't know if that includes YouTube or not.
No, we don't. I mean, right. So, and just the point being, these rules have existed for a long time, saying no one under 13 can or should be on these platforms. And then when you actually ask them, massive numbers of them are. So we're starting with that rule that is there.
And it's important to say here at this point that we've been in conversation with folks at Meta about their new Instagram teen accounts and the ways in which they're creating scaffolding about keeping kids off their platforms before 13, and then having a variety of layers of security and privacy restrictions from 13 to 16. But the biggest issue that we hear from the folks at Meta and from every kid we've ever spoken to and every parent we've ever spoken to is kids lie, and they figure out ways around it, and that there are all sorts of efforts to verify age and, reset kids' access to different platforms. But it's really, really, really complicated. And we can talk about age verification in a second, because that's at the heart of some of the challenges.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should shout out to the social media companies that are making a big effort to try to identify underage users in the name of safety. And one of them is Meta. They've released all of these new tools. Is it perfect? Probably not. Undoubtedly not. But the steps that are being taken to age verify are very different than the steps that were proposed even a year ago. A year ago, it felt so anemic, Vanessa. Like, you and I really had a lot to say that was, we were disappointed in the way that the social media platforms in general were just sort of acknowledging, oh yeah, they put in their birth date, or oh yeah, they get parental approval. Well, everyone knows, even the two grandmothers that were sitting in the front row of that talk the other day, know the kids can run circles. They can very easily get the quote unquote permissions that they need by either just grabbing their parents' device, by hacking into the backend, by logging into them, whatever they do. And so
someone asked me if a kid could wave their phone in front of their parent's sleeping face. Would that work as Face ID?
I mean, that's fascinating, right?
Wow. That is a really deep question. I don't know.
Or a picture of their parent, right? Like, there's lots and lots of, so, just to be clear about what some of these platforms are doing, like Meta is using AI on the back end to actually try to verify the age by using context clues. So they are looking at the conversational threads, the comments that are coming in on posts. And if those conversational threads suggest in a compelling way that a kid is under 16, those kids immediately get shuttled into an under 16 account. Other platforms are doing this other ways. There are also biometrics that are being used. So looking at, like, I look at your face right now, Vanessa, and I would call you 25, but Meta and other companies that are using biometrics would
call me 27.
They would. Yes, they would call you. But that's another way, because there's, I think at this point, global acknowledgement by parents, by kids, and by the platforms themselves that these are destinations where kids want to be. Therefore, the gates to keep kids out and keep them safe have to be a little bit taller, right? So there's all that.
We haven't explored, and we've explored it elsewhere, and we'll do it succinctly here and then go deeper as the conversation continues. Why do people care?
Right.
Why are they banning it? Why are they gating it? Why is Meta putting in these restrictions? Why is Australia creating these laws? Why are US states creating a variety of different legislations? Because the connection between worse mental health and more social media use has been shown in a corollary way, not a causal way, but there are very clear links between more time spent on social media, poorer body image, higher rates of depression and anxiety, higher rates of suicidal ideation. And when I talk about body image, there's also real concerns about eating disorders and the relationship between social media use and eating disorders. So that is at the heart of it, that there is a teen and tween mental health crisis that runs chronologically parallel to the explosion of social media use amongst tweens and teens and adults.
But you bring up the chronology of it, and it's really important to state here that while 13 was a line that was drawn based on no science, but some common sense and a lot of important sort of social safety, so too 16 is an arbitrary line. And you and I went through and did a little bit of a deep dive on the data that Jonathan Haidt used in order to come up with that recommendation. And again, this is complicated. We can hold many things to be true. We are going to hold in one hand the fact that the needle is moving thanks to his book and all the press about his book. And that is an excellent outcome. So that's true in one hand. But in the other hand, when you actually dive into the data, why 16? It's somewhat arbitrary. And we will link to the study that he cites in his book, that I have actually pulled up here on my screen. It's
how much of it are you going to read?
I will read none of it. I will read it to myself later as bedtime story. Windows of Developmental Sensitivity to Social Media. That's the title. That's the only thing I'm going to read. But it's interesting because it's an acknowledgement. This study's an acknowledgement that there are these developmental windows that you can look on a sort of at a 30,000 foot view and say, for girls, it's a little bit younger. The vulnerability is like around 11 to 13. And for boys, it's a little bit older. The vulnerability is around 14 to 15. And then there's this very weak tie in with quote unquote puberty, which isn't made clear at all in the study. I don't see functional MRI scans. I don't see MRI scans. I don't see PET scans. I don't see any brain scanning or imaging that shows physical development. There is a body of behavioral research is very interesting that's linked in this article, but it's a very descriptive study.
Yes,
right?
Because they're measuring, quote, life satisfaction amongst these age groups. And like,
I don't know about you, but I was really satisfied with life when I was 16. No, I was not.
Not only is life satisfaction like just the worst phrase ever, because like from hour to hour, one's life satisfaction changes. But as an adolescent, like what adolescent would, and I'm sure there's all sorts of measures and so on and so forth that they didn't hopefully ask teenagers about their life satisfaction because they would get a whole big fat load of nothing if they asked that question. But to your point, Cara, it is descriptive. What is most helpful in the study upon which all of these international series of legislations, bans, and laws, it's actually really, really fascinating that this cascade of laws and legislations and bans and school districts is sitting on a study which has a series of caveats indicating all of the ways in which their conclusions are speculative.
Just in fairness, any good study lists its limitations, but the word speculation is used so many times in this section of the paper, including twice in one sentence, which is amazing. And so it's all to say, for those of you—
Wait. Before you go to it's all to say, what are they speculating about? This is the heart of this. I mean, we are like, I've never been so amped up at this early in the day, but
at data.
But by the way, for those of you who did not know this, I chose my college major in order to avoid taking statistics. I think I confessed this to Emily Oster on our episode, but like data does not excite me in the way that it excites you, Cara. But this, what you're about, I would give you permission to read it out loud. So I'm going to shorthand it and then I'm going to let Cara read it. But essentially, for those of you who listened to our episode about our concerns with Jonathan Haidt's book, they rested in his use of the word puberty in a very casual, non-specific, and non-data centered way. And for those of you who've read our book, you know that there's a ton of really important research and data around puberty, its earlier onset, what is involved in it, how it impacts kids' bodies. And the big question, which we beg people to research all the time, and maybe this episode will be the final straw that broke the research's back, is the impact of sex hormones on brain development. We do know that sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, cause mood swings, and the hormonal looping that happens in puberty and for the rest of a person's life to a lesser degree can impact how people behave, their moods, their ups, their downs, all of those things. But we are desperate to better understand how hormones affect the very linear process of brain development, and then also how neurons wire and fire because of the stew of sex hormones in which the brain is sitting. And that fascination that we have plays into this very conversation in a really, really profound way.
And I think you summarized it really well. I mean, the sentence that jumped out at me the most when I was reading some of the disclaimers was sort of right before they got to the disclaimer paragraph. They have it's the results section where they do all the data. And I mean, full disclosure, when there's a P score and a range of numbers, my eyes just jump over it usually, and I have to force myself back. Emily Oster, forgive me. But the final two lines in the results section start with the word speculatively, which is really fascinating to me.
You would take a big fat red pen if I ever started a sentence with speculatively.
And goes on to describe sort of why these measurements really do rely on speculation. And as you said, this is, this is not the only study. And this study cites other studies. This study came out in 2022. But it's all to say, no one has a perfect answer. No one has a perfect answer. And certainly no one has a perfect age. So the question that sits before us is this. We know there are negative impacts of social media. Okay. Like whether there's a clear causal link yet or not, I think, Vanessa, you and I are on the right side of history if we acknowledge that at some point there will be a very clear direct line for some kids where their self-esteem or their depression or their anxiety can be directly tethered to their interactions with other kids online in a similar way that bullying in real life can do that, right? I mean, we're not making a giant leap across a cavern here. We know this is where it's going to land. However, what we don't know is the right answer to say, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's draw a hard line at a certain age. Let's arbitrarily pick an age. Let's say it's tethered to hormones. Let's say it's tethered to brain development and decision making. But let's draw a line. And maybe that line, this is how it feels to me that it's being done. Maybe that line should be 16, because after 16, we say kids are developed enough to drive a car. We grant them certain privileges and certain legalities in this world that it would feel a little bit odd to let them do those things, but not be on social media. So let's pick that age and draw the line. And to me, that's not science driven. That's not data driven. And so that's what I'm struggling with. I don't struggle with drawing a line. I actually think drawing a line is good. I just think we have to have a rationale around drawing a line.
Right. And it's like, well, in some states, the age of sexual consent is 16. So there's another arbitrary place, but in other states it's 15 and another, it feels arbitrary, and it feels, I'm going to use the word irresponsible here, not because I think these lawmakers and, advocates and activists and school administrators and all these people are being irresponsible. I think many people are trying to be extremely responsible and reactive to what we're worried about with kids' wellness and safety. On the other hand, if you make a rule, and let's play a game, Cara, in my house, if I made a rule and chose an age that was not based in anything except sticking my finger in the air and thinking, oh, well, maybe this is a good age to let you do X, Y, or Z, my credibility with my kids would be vastly different than if I said to them, hey, listen, you know what? I'm not going to let you do X, Y, or Z because I understand that in a year's time, you will have, reached this milestone in terms of your development or your maturity or your experience, or you will have gone and done this thing, which will then help you be more capable of handling it. Whatever. If I gave the why, which is your favorite thing to do, I would have more credibility as opposed to just saying, this feels about right. We got to do something. So let's just do it and land on this number because some guy put it in his book based on a, frankly, not all that reliable age marker.
And at the risk of politicizing an already sort of politically charged conversation, I don't even know in what direction it's politically charged, but this statement's about to politically charge it. It's going to blow it all up. And I don't mean to equate these things, but the Roe v. Wade decision was written in a way that was predicated on existing science in the early 1970s. And when I was in medical school, we studied not one law other than Roe v. Wade. And this is the 90s. And the reason we studied that law is the science had already made the wording of that law obsolete because the law was written to define when a baby could live outside the womb, and science had then progressed and certain supportive care measures were available. And so the actual numeric answer to when could a baby survive outside the womb had changed. And there were so many people starting when Roe v. Wade was first written who said, be careful how you define these terms because science will always shift. And I only use that example because there are places in which the science will advance and our ability to care for people will shift and change. And there are places where the data will advance, where the imaging will advance, where the measurement of brain development will advance. And we need to be careful that we are not imposing an age limit when there are, I promise you in the next 5 to 10 years, there are going to be better measures of brain maturation and the ability to make good decisions. And it's going to make this feel all the more arbitrary. So it's exactly to your point. Exactly.
And those of us who spend all of our time thinking about, speaking about, talking to, working with tweens and teens, we know that if there are arbitrary rules that do not have a good underpinning, that get at areas that kids really, really want to be a part of, they will do it secretly and they will get around it and they will sneak around. And it then makes our work in keeping them safe and setting realistic limits and parameters and boundaries much, much harder. And again, I am not against having limits on social media and cell phone use and tech use. I am all for it. But it has to be done in a way that actually acknowledges not only what we sort of sense is happening with kids, right? And just to be super clear, the age of vulnerability in this study marks girls from 11 to 13 as most vulnerable and boys 14 to 15. And one of the sort of speculative comments made in the disclaimer portion of the study is that because girls enter puberty earlier than boys, although as you all know, it's a year earlier on average between girls and boys in this country. But if it's happening earlier, that may be why they're seeing the age of vulnerability is earlier. But as we talk about,
it's a lot of speculation.
It's a lot of speculation. And we don't know the difference. Again, please, will someone do this research? we don't know all of the differences, although we do have a wonderful book on the sort of superpower of estrogen, Girls on the Brink by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, who's on the podcast. We do know that estrogen behaves differently in the brain than testosterone, and therefore, as it's surging, it will have different impacts. But that is all to say that this age of sensitivity, fine, important, but there's more information we need. We only have part of the story.
So here we are after a little bit of a rant and a lot of facts. Listeners may be wondering, okay, what do I do with this information?
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Super helpful. So let's sort of lay out some advice, right? And I'll start with this piece of advice. This is no different than any topic we talk about when it comes to coming of age and the transformation of the physical and emotional and social experience of kids. When they are tweens and teens, whether we are talking about their bodies or their devices or the platforms that those devices are connecting to, being in conversation with the kids in your life is literally the single most important piece of this entire puzzle. That the legislation piece is important and helpful and supportive if adults are in partnership with the legislators, just like school rules are helpful and supportive when parents are in partnership with schools. But ultimately, the number one most protective thing any adult can do with any kid is to be in conversation.
And literally, it can sound like this. Hey, this is super interesting. Australia just put a social media ban for teens and kids under 16. What do you think about that? And then sit and see what they say. You can ask, do you think that would ever happen in the US? What age do you think they would use in the US? Why do you think they chose the age 16 in Australia? Because I actually haven't found a lot of great data as to how they chose that age, right? Like there's a series of conversations we can have with kids that are not, you're too young to be on social media. I want you off of social media. I heard that it's terrible for you that you're on social media. You can have a fascinating, connected, constructive conversation with kids about this ban or something else. And it's not personal. It's not accusatory. It's not judgmental. So that would be one way into the conversation. And I just want to say, for those of you who have kids where their school has some sort of ban, or that you're in a state where there's a ban on the books or sort of incoming, I have found teens to be really open to having sophisticated, multifaceted conversations about school bans, how they feel about it, what the parameters are, who's enforcing it. Does that feel fair or not fair? Are they adhering to it? How has it affected them or changed their school experience? Like, I am not being Pollyannish about having these conversations, because I've had these conversations with kids. They're really, really interesting and totally willing to engage.
Another piece of advice is that some of the detractors of the law in Australia say this is going to drive kids to kind of underground online platforms, to places you think Instagram is bad. Just wait till you see where they go. And this sort of circles back to the conversation around porn and around whether we should really be looking wholesale at all the things that kids are exposed to, and why are we only applying this to social media and not looking at other things. But those detractors make a good point, which is, water always finds a way. Like, if you're not in conversation, and if you're just relying upon rules, and if those rules have consequences that are enforced, right? A lot of ifs, kids may, in fact, find a different space that is potentially more toxic or more worrisome. And so it's just a stronger argument to get curious, to leave your judgment aside, to ask them lots of questions, because if they can't engage with you and being on a platform is illegal, talk about a conversation ender. Now they've broken the law. And what's the likelihood that they're going to talk openly with you about how they've broken the law if you've shut down the conversation when it's legal, right? So there's that piece. And then the last little piece that I would bring up is I've been reading a lot about a comparison between smoking bans and social media bans. And the most powerful argument that I've heard here goes something like this. Smoking bans, there's not an issue. There's not a debate. Everyone knows that smoking is bad for you. Social media bans are more complicated because there are elements of social media that have been shown to have really positive effects, and there are elements that have shown to have very negative effects. I personally, Vanessa, would shift that argument a little bit and say smoking bans are based in science. We understand the connection between both nicotine and tar in cigarettes, and then nicotine is an addictive substance in both cigarettes and e-cigarettes and all sorts of other vehicles, and health outcomes. If you need a good reason to get better data around this, that's it. Smoking bans work because there's a clear causal connection. So let's get that data. Let's figure out how to actually measure what the impacts are so that we can get buy-in from the kids who are being told you can't come play in this sandbox.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. It's important to me that we make it clear that this conversation around social media, as you mentioned earlier, Cara, is not any different than any other situation where we are setting limits with kids, where we're setting expectations, where we're aware that they're doing things which actually technically violate a rule or even a law. And how do we have conversations with them? How do we set a culture of values in our own home, which adheres to what we know to be happening under our own roofs, right? So parents of a transgender child whose only community is virtual on one of these platforms, and they have no community in real life and their day-to-day school, will have a very different feeling about a potential ban than a parent whose kid has an opportunity to have an in-person social life in the day-to-day. I want to go back to a point we made at the very beginning, where we were laughing at how the Australian ban puts all of the onus on the technology companies. I go back to that for a reason, because if we are really going to solve the question of how do we help kids be on social media in a way that is additive and not dangerous or harmful to their well-being, that allows them to connect with other people rather than have it be another opportunity for bullying, that allows them to build self-esteem and self-awareness and not feed into disordered eating and lower body image, right? And on and on and on. Like everything else with tweens and teens, this is a job for everyone who touches the lives of these kids to participate in. It's the job of schools, which I would argue schools have taken up the responsibility as much, if not more, than parents have. It's the job of parents. It's the job of, school boards and councils and all of that. It may be the job of politicians and lawmakers, and it is the job of the companies themselves. So to try to make change by putting the burden only on one group is not only unrealistic, it flies in the face of everything we know about how to support, guide, and keep kids safe.
Hallelujah to that. Excited to see where this goes. It's going to be a long year for Australia. I imagine we're going to see a lot of news popping out in the United States, across the country. And as it evolves, we're going to talk about it more, because to beat the dead horse that we have said over and over and over again, finding where to set this limit is really important. Figuring out how to set this limit is really important. Setting it arbitrarily and just assigning an age and leaving all these parents and trusted adults sort of in the lurch, trying to figure out how in the world they're going to be able to enforce it, and where are they going to be complicit or not complicit with their kids breaking these rules and laws. That's what's going to get messy and confusing. And so to those two grandmothers who are sitting in the front row, I say, thank you for showing up and asking the questions and getting curious. Start asking the kids in your life and engage them in conversation, and then go tell your peer group and talk to your own kids, the parent generation, about it. But like, let's open this up for lots and lots of ideation and lots more data collection.
Amen. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myoomla.com.